All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. It looks like we've got most people are on the call already. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our presentation on winter camping. My name is Maya Swope, and I am the Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator here at Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. Really excited that you're here with us this afternoon for the presentation. So a little bit of background about the Friends. For over 40 years, we've been a leader in boundary waters and Quetico superior ecosystem protection, and we've been that leader because of all of you. So as a membership organization, your support is what keeps the work going and what drives us to continue protecting the boundary waters. Today, our work focuses on three main areas, which are wilderness, people, and community. So for wilderness, we are working to stop copper sulfide mining, specifically twin metals and polymet mines, which pose a major threat to the wilderness. For people, our No Boundaries to the Boundary Waters program connects young people to all sorts of things related to the boundary waters through classroom education, online programs, and also scholarships for wilderness trips. For community, we recognize the importance of gateway communities up north and that the fate of these communities is really tied to protecting the boundary waters as well. So we've recently hired a community coordinator up in Ely, and actually this past month we've been sponsoring movies at the Ely State Theater. So I also wanted to jump in kind of with an update of breaking news that we just received this morning. So in a decision out this morning, the Minnesota State Supreme Court remanded the polymet air pollution permit to the Court of Appeals. So this means that they sent the case back to the Court of Appeals to continue the investigation into whether polymet withheld their plans to expand their mine beyond the limits of the permits. Polymet has really engaged in bait and switch tactics to avoid air pollution standards, and we're glad that the Supreme Court is giving this further opportunity to explore that case and make the case for that. This decision really shows, though, that the state's process for granting these permits is broken, and it really underscores the need for a prove it first law in Minnesota. So I'll put some info about that in the chat when I'm done speaking here. There's a lot of details in this really complicated case, so stay tuned for more information. We'll be scheduling a webinar and some emails to go out about this to give you the full scoop on that. So that's it for the update from me. We're really excited to have you all here. Scott Oath is our presenter today. He's got lots of experience winter camping and in the boundary waters and has some really great tips for how to have a safe and fun winter camping experience. One note is that we will have time for question and answers at the end of the session. So if you do have any questions throughout, you can put them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So I will turn it over to you, Scott, to introduce yourself further and to get started with the presentation.
Great, thanks, Maya. As Maya said, I'm Scott Oath. I live in the Twin Cities area, have spent most of my life in the upper Midwest, and lifelong passionate outdoors person, and really love winter camping. So excited to have the opportunity to talk with you all about this. I do a lot of volunteer work with the Boy Scouts. It's a big part of my winter camping background, and particularly special to me because that was where I got my start. I remember the excitement I had the first time we built a Quincy, a snow shelter, and slept out on a frozen lake. And so I've stayed involved as an adult volunteer, both at the High Adventure Base in the Boundary Waters, which is a national program, and with the Minneapolis-St. Paul Council. I also have my own company where I guide private trips and teach outdoor skills courses and blog about wilderness skills. So what I put together here is just a basic kind of intro about winter camping, kind of hitting some of the high notes. I actually have quite a bit of material put together in the form of either blog post or radio interviews, which are archived, that go a lot deeper on a lot of these topics. So I might reference some of those. I think Maya is going to send out a resource list after the program where a lot of these things we have, like say deeper details. So I guess first, to start, why do this at all? Are we nuts wanting to go winter camping? What is this all about? And I'd say, I don't like being cold. I don't think anyone does. But man, I love winter camping. It's something, I think about in the summer and the beauty. The slide there I have, that's from Flash Lake, just near Moose Lake, east of Ely. Absolutely stunning scenes in the winter camping, and there's something very special about the light and the snow and just the things that you can see. The northern lights potentially at times. Potentially hearing wolves calling across a frozen lake. The beauty is spectacular. The challenge and adventure, for sure. I really enjoy the extra challenge and complexity with winter camping. I like to tell people, I think of it as like a chess match compared to normal camping. You have less daylight, the conditions are a lot tougher, they're less forgiving. You really need to be thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead in terms of your timeline and preparing your meals and getting your water, adjusting and managing your clothing. So there is an extra skill level. We don't have mountains per se here in Minnesota, but we do have some pretty serious winter conditions. And if that's something that gets you excited, is seeking higher skill levels, I think winter camping is a great way to do it. The next thing, listen, it's fun. I have a group that I've been doing for almost 20 years, a group of guys. They're not necessarily hardcore outdoors people, but they love our annual January winter camp out. And that one's just a fun, low-key gathering. It's a little taste of adventure for them. It's a chance to get together when everyone's been cooped up inside all winter. And, we always have a good time. And I think, that kind of plays into the next one. We're seeing more and more coming out all the time, headlines about being in nature is good for you. And I imagine if you're listening to this webinar, you're fully on board with that. And this is nothing new, but we're hearing about people being prescribed time in nature deficit disorder, the impact of seeing green and getting the fresh air. It's all wonderful for you. And I think it's nice we have this technology, so we're gathered here to share, but we probably are all suffering from too much screen time. We could use the digital diet and get out and smell some wood smoke and the crunch of snow under our feet and enjoy the outside life. So I do think there's an important point though at the end. Mental attitude, I think, we talk about expedition behavior. If I'm putting a group together for a wilderness trip, we have a lot of talk ahead of time about what to expect and mindset. And in winter camping especially, or any hard wilderness trip, I really think thinking about and understanding that there probably will be times where you are a bit physically uncomfortable. That's not the goal. It shouldn't be long-term, but yeah, there might be a time or two where your hands are feeling cold and we need to take actions and adjust that, or getting into or out of bed might not be all that great. There'll be periods there where it's going to be challenging, just like canoe camping in the Boundary Waters in the summer. Hey, your feet are probably going to be wet most of the time. If you just accept that up front, then you're not tippy-toeing and dancing around in sharp rocks and risking getting hurt trying to avoid it. And so a positive mental attitude goes a long way in winter camping. If you think you're going to have a bad time and be cold and miserable, you probably are. But if you're excited about it, you embrace the challenge, and you're thinking ahead of time and work on your game, you'll probably have a great time. So thanks, Maya. So, when I start talking about winter camping, I get a lot of questions about gear. What type of sleeping bag, what types of boots, what type of jacket, down or synthetics, all kinds of questions about gear. Gear is important, and you need the right type of gear. You can see the photo there of a friend and I, bundled up heavily in parkas and a couple layers of balaclavas and mitts. And that was a very cold weekend in the Boundary Waters. So gear is important. But the first thing I think to understand is understanding your body and how to really manage your body's thermostat and use your body as a heat pump. The science and the physiology is the most important thing. And so I like to start by talking with people about, how do you get cold? What are the mechanisms of heat loss? It's kind of a fancy term. And conduction, touching cold things. So in particular, winter camping, the things I think are very important are your hands can get cold very, very quickly if you're touching a cold metal stove, or you're touching a metal shovel handle, or some type of tool like that, maybe the ski poles or runners on your sled, that touching, that heat loss, the transfer from your body to a colder surface. Your feet are another big one. Having warm feet is a challenge for a lot of folks, and you tend to lose a lot of heat to the ground, especially if you're standing on frozen ice. So extra insoles in your boots, standing on top of a insulated pad, things like that can really help with conductive heat loss. Convection, cold wind blowing around. So we're going to talk about dress and how you dress to prevent losing the bubble of body heat in your clothing. Radiation, your body's constantly giving off heat. I've heard the statistic that the average human body gives off as much heat as a light bulb each hour. So kind of interesting stat. And we protect against radiation basically by insulating type clothes. The convection would be more wind layers. Evaporation. This is a real big one. Moisture management is a term. Dealing with moisture, both externally and coming from our body, is a huge issue in winter camping. In the summer, it's not that big of a deal. In the fall, it's more of a challenge, but in the winter, it is a really big challenge. And you can see even in this photo, the young woman in the red, look at the scarf and balaclava around her face from her breath, her respiration coming out and freezing on her clothing. And respiration is the next one. We lose heat through respiration, but then also that evaporative heat loss. If your clothing gets wet, it can wick away heat 25 times faster than dry clothing. So we think about how we're dressing, how we're able to manage our body so we're not over sweating, how we're able to unbutton or roll up our sleeves, but also the materials that we're using are critically important in the winter for managing that moisture. Homeostasis is kind of a fancy term for your body working to maintain an even heat distribution. And if you get too hot, it pumps blood out to your limbs where they radiate off heat. The really interesting thing, even though I've spent a lifetime in the cold, winter camping, hunting, ice fishing, sledding, all this great stuff, skiing, I didn't really realize that it's pretty remarkable. The human body will shut down blood flow to the extremities if it starts sensing a cold challenge. So your fingers and toes start getting cold. It's very likely because your body's cold overall, and the body is working to protect your heart, your lungs, your core organs. So it can actually shut down 99% of the blood flow, I've read, to your extremities. And that warming blood flow really is part of what helps keep you warm. So dressing and fueling and eating yourself, shelter, all that to keep your core warm will help keep the blood flow going to your extremities and maintaining that homeostasis, that balance. So this is a couple of these points, like I mentioned before. I have blog post and some radio interviews. We'll send you links to that. We go quite a bit more in depth on these topics. Food and hydration, your body is its own heat pump. You've got a furnace there and you need to stoke it up. So it's one of the things that's fun about winter camping. Hey, you get to eat a lot, guilt-free. You need to be stoking the boiler, putting a lot of calories in there, and fairly regularly too. It's not, especially if you're doing what we call cold camping, where you're not using a wood burning stove in a tent, you're really just relying on your body. Having, just like building a fire, tinder, kindling, and fuel. Tinder is, maybe sugars, your quick burning type foods. Kindling might be, more normal type things. And then, fats and some meat to some extent. The meat has thermogenic effect and longer lasting heat with your body. And hydration, I'll probably touch on this later, but dehydration is one of the key issues and key problems we see when we're guiding people on winter trips. Is you can lose a lot of fluids in the cold, dry winter air, and you don't necessarily feel thirsty. You're not hot. You don't necessarily feel that thirst. You get dehydrated. Your blood volume actually decreases. Your blood flow decreases. And there again, you start getting cold. And plus you need to stay hydrated to be able to digest all that extra food well. So next slide, please. So, how can we create or absorb heat? We got a photo there. Again, that's a Boundary Waters trip. I guess what we're looking at is we built up a snow kitchen. That's one of the fun things to do with your shovel. If you're cold, there's always some good use that can be done, either sawing wood or shoveling snow. So we built up a standing height kitchen table there essentially, and a windbreak. And we've got several stoves going, boiling water. This is a pretty big group. That's why there's the numerous pots boiling. But, as we talked about, food can help keep you warm. The calories, maybe a bit of extra fat, a bit of extra protein, hot food, sugary food. Often on winter trips, especially if it's quite cold will distribute snacks in the morning, cheese sticks, beef sticks, candy bars, things like that. Give them to people to put in their pockets. And it solves a couple purposes. First of all, their body heat thaws it out and keeps it warm. And then they have some ready snacks at hand in case they start feeling a little bit cold or low on energy. You're also working really hard, trudging through the snow. You're wearing heavy layers of clothing. You might be shoveling and sawing. So having that extra food at hand helps a lot. And especially the scouts will have water bottles that hang on a cord around the neck in a sock that people can wear, over their shirt, but inside their wind layer and inside their parka. So their body heat helps keep that water not solid, drinkable. And also it's very easy to check then and go around and take a look and say, well, how much have you been drinking? Show me your water bottle, because people tend to forget how much they're drinking. So external heat sources, of course, fire, hand warmers. We could have a whole bunch of things there, sun, heated shelters. But the main thing is, I think my philosophy with winter camping and winter skills in general is you want to be adequately dressed and know how to dress and know how to eat and drink to maintain your body heat in the conditions without any external heat. And then anything you can do that's additive to that, having a big fire, having a tent with a wood burning stove, having hand warmers or hot water bottles, all of those items are then additive and will just add to your comfort level. But you have a baseline of being able to manage yourself in the cold with just eating, drinking, and your clothing. And it can be done. That largely is the Boy Scout program in the Boundary Waters. They, because of safety concerns, do not allow the tents with the wood burning stoves. And so everything we're doing is snow shelters or what would be considered cold camping, and very cold conditions, but we're able to take people out. And often people from the South, they're the most interesting coming up and having this experience. And we get them out there and keep everyone safe and have a good time. So maybe next slide, please. So thinking about clothing, how do you dress? And here again, back to the questions I get regularly. Well, what jacket do I wear? Or, I'll even get questions on brands. And I'll say right up front, I almost don't think brands matter, or they don't matter much. What matters much more is the principles of the clothing, the properties, what it's made out of, the cut, the fit. A lot of my stuff, I'm a frugal guy, and it goes back to a scout is thrifty. And a lot of people I'm taking out, they don't have thousands of dollars to go and invest in high-end, mountaineering type gear just for a weekend winter camp out. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how can we do this using what people already have or boosting their system up with, relatively low cost solutions. So clothing, we definitely think about clothing, sleeping as a system. And I've got the acronym COLDER there at the top. And so that's something we talk about when we're dressing. We want to keep our clothes clean. If stuff gets sooty, dirty, greasy, it can lose its insulation. We want to avoid overheating is the O. So dressing in layers helps with that, and also managing our pace and really adjusting clothing. And the L, we want our clothing to be loose and layered. So a lot of modern clothing, a lot of ski type clothing is very tight fitting, form fitting. It looks good. That's not really what you want for winter camping. There again, back to the warming blood flow. If you're wearing tight pants or snug gloves, socks that are too tight or too many socks with your foot stuffed into a boot, you're cutting off blood flow, which is really key for keeping you warm. We know from first aid, we can put a tourniquet around a limb to clamp off blood flow and prevent blood loss. And I've seen people, even when we talk about it, there is a fear of being cold. There's a real psychological challenge. And sometimes even when we talk about these principles, I've witnessed, a fellow friend of mine who's pretty experienced, and he's putting on 2, then 3 pairs of socks, and he's physically grunting, trying to pull on his boots, stuff his foot into the boot. And I was like, I think you're going to have cold feet if you do that, because it's too much that wasn't allowing for good blood flow or the insulation to loft up. So loose and layered clothing, we want to keep our clothing dry, and the E and R, examine and repair, and that's more long-term. That's an acronym that comes from the military and the military cold weather leaders. Training. Layers. Everyone's heard about dressing in layers, and I think that gets thrown around a lot. Put your layers on, but what does that actually mean, and what are we trying to do? I think the key things are we are worried about moving moisture away from our body, managing moisture, being able to regulate our heat, easily. Those are the key things with layers. It is a warm way to dress, but I believe there's actually a bit of a misconception that the layers are warmer. That's more about just the pure thickness of the insulation. But I have WWW and then an M. So I like to think of wicking layers, warmth layers, wind layers to block the wind. And then M, I call it a monster layer, big, thick, puffy layers, because the way we dress when we're active in the winter is different than sedentary. If you're pulling a toboggan across a lake in the snow, you might be right down to your base layer, or maybe a base layer with just your wind shell over the top to block the wind. But it's completely different at night when the sun is going down and maybe the wind's picked up and you're not moving. When you're sedentary, large, high loft, puffy insulated clothing is the name of the game. So I tend to think at least in 3 sets of clothing. What's my active wear? What's my sedentary, at night and base camp wear? And that'll be different if I'm cold camping versus if I'm using a heated hot tent, and then a dry set to sleep in. So wet cold versus dry cold. I think this is a really important concept. I really have 2 completely different styles of dressing and preparing for winter trips. Wet, cold conditions, we typically consider that if we know that it's going to be consistently below 15 or 20 degrees, somewhere in that range, all the external moisture is going to be frozen. It's going to be snow, it's going to be dry snow. If anything's falling, it's snow. And so we don't have to worry about getting wet from the outside. But the real challenge is our body's perspiration and our respiration coming out and freezing in our clothing and transferring that out. So if it's a dry cold, we want very breathable clothing that lets that body vapor get away from us. Wet cold would be anything that's, say above 15 to 20 degrees. And the problem is it can change throughout the day. You could have warmer periods during the day and then things get cold at night. But wet cold conditions can be really tough. And there we're worried about, it's cold temperatures, but we could have slush, we could have slushy, sleety rain coming down, and we need to be worried about that external moisture as well. There's a photo of me in the top right there with the red parka with the black on the shoulders and the ice pick around my neck. I put that one in because I think that's one of the best photos I have that kind of captures the challenge of a wet cold. So that was a winter trip in northern Maine, and we're pulling out. We actually woke up at about 4 a.m. because temperatures have been right around 30 in the low 30s. And so tons of snow, lakes were frozen. That's what we got in, but it was warming over the course of our trip. And so we woke up very early to try and pull out and make sure it's a little bit colder on the ice. And you can see the people behind me there are dropping layers because it's so warm as we're pulling things out. And you can see my hair is a little wet. My jacket is wet. And it was really a challenge. It was alternating between snow and rain. And then of course you stop, you get chilled very quickly. So people tend to think about hypothermia, and hypothermia is really a challenge. The biggest challenge I have as a guide is spring canoe trips with wet water and rain and wind. Someone gets dunked in a cold river in the fall, being out when it could be cold and wet and windy. And winter camping trips are considered a wet cold. When it's that true dry cold, frostbite and frost nip are more of an issue than hypothermia typically. So I do have more written on this, but it really is 2 different styles of dress. You can use what we consider wet cold type materials like synthetic Gore-Tex type shells, synthetic clothing that works in a dry cold. But the problem is your moisture coming out hits a freezing point, and it often doesn't get passed through things like the more modern Gore-Tex shell materials. And old school, wool breathes very, very well. And a lot of people have heard, never wear cotton. Cotton's rotten. Cotton is death cloth. You'll die if you wear a cotton. We don't want any cotton as a base wicking layer. We don't want it as a warmth layer because if it gets wet, it's going to be ruined. But cotton shells actually make a very good wind layer in very cold, dry conditions because they pass that vapor very easily. In the lower right, I have 3 different shell garments laid out there, a red Gore-Tex type jacket, lightweight waxed canvas 60/40 cloth, and then the white one on the right, that's just a pure cotton anorak, and that's actually a Swedish army garment. And so I think the Swedes know a thing or two about dressing for the cold. So it is fairly specialized. In most parts of the country, they don't have consistent dry cold like we might have in the boundary waters. So different types of materials. Materials are important. What types of materials we want near your body. Really, the main things to think about are wool or synthetics. And there's nice merino wool fibers, which make wonderful base layer, long underwear, socks. It's very soft. It wicks moisture away. It absolutely absorbs a small amount of it and gets warmed up. Wool, the old lumberjacks you'd read, they dressed head to toe in wool, and the old saying was wool is warm when it's wet. I think it's much better than cotton. It will probably keep you alive, but it's, wet wool is not necessarily super fun to wear anyway, but wool has a lot of advantages. I think some of the big ones are it's a natural material, naturally renewable. When the garment's done, it just dissolves and goes back to nature. Wool you can wear for a long time and it doesn't stink, versus a lot of the modern synthetics just smell terrible even after a day or two, which can make being in a snow shelter or a tent not as much fun. And a big one, if you're using a fire-based system, a hot tent, or large outdoor fires, a lot of the synthetics will melt just like that or pick up spark holes, versus wool is heat resistant and does pretty well with sparks. So like this shirt is a polyester fleece. It's a great garment for the outdoors, but I'm careful with it around fire. And I'll actually often wear a thin wool shirt over the top if I'm working around a fire, just to prevent getting that melting. So the lofted layers for your monster layer, your big puffy layer, down versus synthetics, hey, they both work. Down is super lightweight. It feels wonderful. I find down keeps me warm, but it's rare that I feel too hot in down. It has sort of a breathable type quality. But the really thing we want to watch out for is if it gets wet, I think most of us know down becomes worthless. So with kids, or if I'm cold camping, sleeping in snow shelters, synthetic fills like Thinsulate or Primaloft or other types of, even no-name synthetics. One of my favorite garments is a vest I bought at a thrift store for a couple bucks. I don't know what's in it. It's some type of synthetic fill, but it works just fine. The synthetics are typically bulkier. They don't quite have that warmth to weight ratio. If they're used hard, like it's say in sleeping bags, the synthetics can actually get sort of crushed and break down over time and lose their insulating properties. And they're made out of plastic, which some people don't like the idea of. But I think it both works. It's about understanding your system and kind of knowing the pros and cons of each. Hands, feet, head. I've written detailed pieces, have radio interviews on both those. So I'm not going to spend much time on that, other than talking about the idea of don't forget to think about your core, being well fed, being hydrated, staying warm with your core so you can maintain that blood flow, having loose and layered clothing. That will help your hands and feet a whole lot. And then beyond that, you can get into some of the specifics of different types of mittens and footwear. So how do you sleep in the cold? This is a big hurdle, I find, for a lot of people. Is, again, that psychological barrier of, oh my gosh, I'll go out. That sounds fun. I'll go skiing or snowshoeing or ice fishing or get on a snowmobile or whatever it is. But sleeping out overnight is both sounds challenging and exciting and also very scary. And it can be intimidating. And there's a tremendous difference. Winter camping at 20 above is very doable, can be very pleasant. You get to say 20 below, it's a completely different game. To those temperatures and colder, it can be pretty intimidating, the thought of sleeping out. So same type of thing as with the clothing. I like to think of a sleep system versus a sleeping bag. So when people say, what type of sleeping bag should I get? Say, well, let's talk about the whole system here and the whole process of sleeping in the cold and things you can do to beef up your existing sleeping gear. Nutrition, here again, don't go to bed hungry and you don't want to go to bed cold. There's a saying we like to say that it's a lot easier to stay warm than to try and get warm. It's a lot easier to stay dry than to try and get dry in the field. So we want to be well fed. We want to be well hydrated, not overly so before bed, because then you have kind of the issue of having to get up and go to the bathroom frequently. But you want to make sure that you're not depleted. Again, being out in the cold is taxing and it wears out your body. And so you probably want that high calorie meal, then maybe a snack. With the scouts, often we distribute a little candy bar or snack with them to take to bed and keep tucked into a pocket or under their stocking cap for when they wake up chilly in the night. And you tell them to get up, go to the bathroom, do some deep knee bends, swing your arms around, get the body moving a little bit, eat your snack, take a little drink of water, and then you get back in your sleeping bag and you're usually warm for the rest of the night with that little sugar boost and getting essentially the urine out of your body, which can really make you kind of cold. I'll often do, if I'm sleeping outside just under the stars, which I do pretty frequently, it's like I have a little nighttime workout. Do some deep knee bends. I'll shovel some snow. I even run sprints. I get my body nice and warmed up, fluff up the sleeping bag, then do my changing and get into bed and usually fall asleep nice and warm then. So sleep system, you can buy wonderful sleeping bags that are designed and rated for -20, -40. They're fantastic. They're very high loft, great insulation, great draft collars and hoods. But they're pretty specialized. You're probably not going to use those the rest of the year. So you have to think about how often are you really going to be winter camping, and they're not cheap. So what I do personally, and what I recommend to a lot of people, is trying a 2-bag system. And it's just a matter of getting enough insulation over you. The design features on the Sirius winter bags are better. They have better draft collars and hoods. So we have to think about ways to help beef up the system. But in the top left there, that's a setup I've used many, many times. I've slept out at 20 and 30 below, just in a trench under the stars with that system, and it works. What you're looking at there from the ground up, you can't quite see, but there's a tarp down as a barrier from the snow, kind of help keeps your gear sorted, keeps things from freezing to the ice. At least 2, sometimes 3 pads, usually 2 closed cell, like the Ridge Rest, or even those cheap blue type pads stacked up, and one of the inflatable Thermarest type pads, one of the thick ones. I believe I put the closed cell pad on top of the Thermarest because I think you want the closed cell foam next to your body, so it's not sucking away as much heat as the open cell foam of the Thermarest. I'll also often lay one of those foil mylar coated windshield screens that you can buy for a couple bucks at the dollar store to put in the window of your car to keep sun out. I lay one of those underneath. It provides just a little extra bit of insulation. And I think it also helps with some of the radiant heat loss to the ground. You can see just barely peeking out there a green wool blanket. If you have room and you can bring it along, a nice thick woven wool blanket. I like having that as part of the base of my sleep system. I usually fold it in thirds. So it's underneath. There's another layer under me, and then I have a flap that I can put out on my tarp for when I'm changing my boots or my clothing. It's sort of like a doormat, and then I fold that under me again right before I go to sleep. The other things that go under me are my wool pants, my wool sweater. Those get laid out flat underneath me on top of my pad, so they provide a little extra insulation. And the other thing is, your body is running just about 100 degrees all night long, and you're pumping out that heat, and you will actually dry out clothing underneath you that way, and it works quite well. So all that is before I even get to the sleeping bag, because we're worried about that conductive heat loss to the ground. And in the boundary waters, we're often sleeping on lake ice, which can be really cold. So the rest of the system there, you see that camouflage cover. That's a U.S. military surplus bivy sack. It's made out of Gore-Tex, so that does a few things for me. It blocks the wind, helps with that convection. It also creates a frost barrier, frost layer. So the moisture coming out of my body, I want to get that out of my sleeping bag and out of my insulation. So I'm 98.6 degrees. I'm pushing out this moisture all night long, and it might be 0 or -20 or -30 coming in. That moisture is going to freeze at some point. And if I have that Gore-Tex shell over my bag, it helps that moisture travel further, and it might freeze inside the Gore-Tex bag, but at least not inside the sleeping bag. If you read about the Minnesota polar explorers, Will Steger, Ann Bancroft, Paul Shirky that went to the North Pole in the 80s, they were using, it's kind of a classic story. Their sleeping bags gained, I think it's something like 25 pounds of frost accumulated in the bag over the course of their trip from their body, giving that off each night and then freezing. So for shorter trips, I do this type of technique where I'm just trying to use layers in my system to move the moisture out. If I'm in a heated tent, it's so much easier because that heat, when you get the stove going, dries things out. Another technique that's pretty common with mountaineers and climbers is what's called a vapor barrier system. And you can do this in your sleeping bag and your clothing. And that really is having some type of impermeable membrane close to your body. So you'd wear a base layer of socks, or inside your sleeping bag, maybe you're a lightweight base layer, and then a plastic bag, essentially, garbage bag with one cutout, two to make a tunnel, or you can buy special bags inside. And what that does is it's just another layer to hold warmth next to you, but it also keeps all that moisture out of your insulation. So the two bag system, it allows for a lot of flexibility. Both those sleeping bags shown there, the red one, that's a bag I bought from LL Bean, lightweight down bag for, $100 some. And then the yellow and green one is an old mystery bag that my dad had that's kind of a thick down bag. And that works very well. On the bottom, there's maybe just a couple things to point out. That hood, you can see it's separate from the sleeping bag. That's a hood I found from a parka that's detachable. So that helps provide a little extra insulation on my head. And I tend to sleep on my side and turn around. So that keeps the insulation on my head. That plaid colored thing is actually a cotton shamag, which is really nice to wrap around your neck or your head. I find usually if I'm doing a weekend trip, I have 1 or 2 or 3 items that are sort of sacrifice type items to put over my face at night, and I breathe into it, and it helps protect my nose and cheekbones, but they get all frosted up, and then I just kind of put it in my bag and take a new one out for the next night. But it helps kind of prevent some of that exposure and windburn on my cheekbones and nose and all that. Another trick I've found, if you have a sleeping bag that's even like the above ones where there's a hood, but it's not the big built up winter hood, is I'll take an extra vest, and this is kind of goofy, but instead of putting my arms through and snapping it up this way, I put it in upside down. So my neck is still in the neck hole, but the body is up here. And then I can pull the vest down, cinch up my sleeping bag. And then I have this wonderful pile of the vest that really act as a stopper, as a draft collar. So your clothing, I mentioned, like heavy wool garments, I will put underneath me. My parka, especially if I'm worried about the cold, I'll lay it over my torso, and that can help a lot. If I have a big down parka or synthetic parka kind of over my top to keep my core really warm. Anything that's electronics, you want to sleep with them. I have a pouch that I put in my sleeping bag. I'm thinking about sewing more pockets inside my sleeping bag because, it'll suck the life out of the electronics. Boot liners, you'd really want to remove those and put those in your sleeping bag, and often tuck the boots underneath your knees, the upper parts of your boots, because if you just leave those out, they'll freeze solid. And a lightweight, loose, dry clothing system, big fluffy dry socks put on at night. I found, if you're sleeping in a tent with the heated wood burning stove, you can probably just wear your base layer that you've been wearing all day and you'll be fine. But if you're sleeping outside in a snow shelter, you really want a separate, completely dry set of clothing to wear in the bag. But one of the other benefits of the two bag system is things like glove liners or your stocking cap or your scarf that might be a bit damp or frosted up. You don't want things that are really wet. Those can go between the layers of your sleeping bag and they'll dry out pretty well overnight because you're pumping out warm heat. So we talked about midnight snack and nature's call. Some people use a pee bottle. Essentially, I tend to just get up. So, but it'll probably happen. Don't try and hold it all night. You'll be cold. Just be prepared. There again, the positive mental attitude. Just accept that I'm going to get up. So let's talk about shelters. Lots of options here. I think this is interesting. Winter camping is kind of a very micro niche market, but there's still a lot of different styles. You have people that hammock camp, and there's winter backpackers, and there's mountaineers, and there's polar explorers, and there's traditional trappers and hunters. And so you have a whole gamut here. There's different styles. And I think there's a lot of valuable experience coming from different places, but it's in part where you're at. Are you dealing with elevation? Are you dealing with dry cold or wet cold? Are you traveling a lot? Are you more base camping? There's a lot of things that kind of come into play here. But two broad divides are the hot tenting, and that's using some type of tent or shelter with a wood burning stove, or maybe a propane heater in the shelter, versus the cold camping. And we have a couple pictures down at the bottom. On the left, there's your classic Northwoods wall tent that's on a trip in Maine, sort of a permanent fixed base camp where they have special use permits in the Maine Northwoods to maintain a trail of heated wall tents like that for dog sled trips. The brown teepee is a photo from the Winter Camping Symposium here in Minnesota, which I put a plug in for that. One of my favorite events every year in late fall. It's just a fantastic gathering, lots of how-to sessions, learning, and just a whole lot of camaraderie and fun and getting together and sharing techniques. But that's more of a modern hot tent. The nylon or sil nylon wall, and you can see the chimney pipe just barely peeking out the top. Big difference is, the cotton type traditional shelter, it's going to be heavier, it's going to be bulkier, but that fabric there, again, it breathes well, especially with the hot stove running, it pushes moisture out. You have a bit more of an issue with the nylon tents that condensation will form on the inside. So that might be an acceptable trade-off if you're seeking lightweight and you're traveling, or a lot of Western hunters, like elk hunters, use those types of shelters, and they want that because it's lightweight and they can backpack with it, and they're not going to carry in a canvas wall tent. But if you're using, the sled or the polk, boy, that canvas tent with a wood burning stove is it's a portable cabin. It's a wonderful way to camp. It's my favorite by far. It lets you relax in the evening, lets you dry your gear, which is just critical. You can live indefinitely in one of those types of setups. So. But there are disadvantages. There's setup time, there's cost. Those types of tent things are not cheap, especially if you're just looking to just give winter camping a try, or something you're doing once or twice a year. You might find that to be a bit of a hurdle. You can rent those setups from some of the outfitters in the Boundary Waters, or potentially go with a guide that I have setups like that for a cruise I take out. Maybe we could just go back just a few more comments there, Maya. So cold camping, snow shelters, or like on the right, that's actually a teepee that's just being set up as a wind shelter. Cold camping, it can be easy, it can be quicker. In sleeping in a Quincy, so I've written a pretty in-depth article on the Quincy, which is that snow tunnel, the shelter you see in the middle where you mound up snow, let it harden, hollow out the middle. It's actually quite warm inside the Quincy. It just takes a lot of work and a lot of time to build one. And I'll say, even though I have the hot tent, as often as not, I simply sleep out under the stars because I just like the simplicity of it. I love being able to wake up and look at the stars, and it's a fast, light, easy way to go. But lots of options here. All right, let's move on. So some key tools, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but other than saying, make sure you're well prepared. You want to have a good knife, I think, on your body at all times. One that can help you get a fire going is really key. So something that can shave wood, can maybe split kindling, like a nice fixed blade knife with a solid tang that's not going to break. Also, a fixed blade knife or a one-hand opening one is really key in the cold, so you're not necessarily having to take your mittens off and open up a small Swiss Army knife. I should say, having the tools with you to repair ski bindings or stoves or any other items like that is really key. Shovel, shovels are so underrated, so useful, especially in winter camping. I'm usually taking 2, sometimes 3 different shovels. Large scoop grain shovels can really move snow. That can be great, especially if you're building snow shelters. If we're building snow shelters, I want a big shovel for each person in the crew so everyone can lend a hand. Oftentimes, even if I'm just out skiing or out for a day, I'll bring one of the small collapsible type emergency shovels. You can buy fancy caving type ones, snow cave ones from mountaineers. I found, ice fishing supply have, pretty cheap ones, but those are really handy for digging out the inside of a snow shelter, and they're good to have you with just an emergency in case you need to make a little trench or snow wall to sleep in. An axe is going to be crucial if you're doing the hot tent type winter camping to split wood. Saw, very useful for anyone, be able to bring wood down and section it safely. Axe, a I love axes, but they can be incredibly dangerous. Okay. And especially in the dark, in the cold, if you're a little bit hypothermic, if you're in a little bit of a hurry trying to get camp set up. So there's a whole lot to safe axe use, and you really want to be overly cautious. So I find most people, the classic, looking for a chopping block, setting the log on top, trying to chop up here. It's a very high point of contact. There's a lot that can go wrong. You know, one of the best things I can say is learn how to find a log that's laying down, put your section there and kneel down and split. So your point of contact is only a few inches above the ground. And you're not letting that axe head get below the handle where it's coming back towards you. So a lot that could be said there, but key tool, but a lot of things that can go wrong. Stoves, you know, especially if you're cold tent camping, having a backpacking type stove or something like that to cook and melt is key. You need to know a lot of them don't work very well in the cold. Classic white gas type stoves are, in my mind, the best. You know, I like the Coleman single burners, like the Coleman Peak 1 stoves, the Coleman 502s, or the heavy duty like Optimus 111s. Those put out a lot of heat. They're very robust. Make sure your stove is in very good working order. Test it before you go out. You probably need a primer. Be very careful because the gas does not freeze at 32 degrees. It can be 20 below, and if you get a splash of white gas on your skin, you can get a terrible burn. A lot of the canister type stoves, they don't work very well in the cold. There's cold weather mixes, but they're just a lot more finicky. So be sure you test that out. Lighting, it gets dark earlier and it's dark for a long time. So good headlamp, I really recommend 2. Lithium batteries do a lot better in the cold. I usually end up wearing my headlamp around my neck, just keep it there in my sleeping bag in case I have to get up at night. I can just pull it on, and also helps keep it warm. So next slide, please. So where to go? I think the first thing, unless you're going with someone who's really experienced, has all the gear, you know, right in your backyard or nearby park or something like that. Test run, practice. It helps you test your gear. It lets you try different combinations. It lets you get the feel for it. I think very importantly, it'll help you build up your confidence. You know, I typically sleep in my backyard even now a couple times per winter because I want to try different combinations of sleeping bags or clothing. So backyard, great place to start, or, you know, your friend's backyard or whatever. Nearby adventures. I think one of the really cool things about the winters, you don't have to go as far, or I find you don't have to go as long to get that same taste of adventure or that same solitude. You know, there's not nearly as many people out in the state parks. State forest, county forest are great resources because a lot of them allow dispersed camping, and you don't have to necessarily go all that far off into the woods to have a little solitude in your little chunk of land. Just be careful if it's an area near popular, you know, snowmobile trails, things like that. You might see a lot of traffic, so you want to try and plot it out. And then, of course, the boundary waters. You know, this is pinnacle experience in our region. It is a phenomenal experience. Can't recommend it enough. You know, the beauty, the conditions that you are able to experience there. You know, that real dry cold and the deep snow and the deep cold. It is fantastic. So let's see, maybe next slide. I will just touch on this. I have talked on this. I just recently did a radio interview, which is up on my site, but some of the key injuries, dehydration, I touched on. You want to stay well hydrated, frostbite and frost nip, be aware there. And I mean, be aware of the issue, but also you want to be very proactive. Here again, with a lot of these things, winter camping is a chess match. Be thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So you don't want to get frostbite or frost nip. The buddy system works very well. It's what we have scouts do. Find your buddy, practice saying, I'm cold and I need help. A lot of people are reluctant. They don't want to bring down the trip. They don't want to cause a problem. But, you know, people need to know when to ask, and having someone else check on them. If you're out on a cold, windy lake, it's very easy to start getting frostbite or frost nip on your earlobes, your nose, your cheekbones, and someone else who can take a look and say, hey, I see a white spot, you know, here on your cheekbone. And the fastest, easiest thing is just skin on skin contact to warm that up. Hypothermia, absolutely a serious issue. It is a killer. This is the killer in the woods in survival situations, you know, when people have an accidental emergency. So, you know, clothing, awareness, food, the ability to start a fire are all key. Snow blindness, you know, this is something I never used to pay attention to, and I kind of regret, wish I would have taken better care of my eyes when I was younger, but you can damage your eyes, you know, with the reflection coming off the snow and the brightness, so make sure you bring sunglasses. Immersion foot and chilblains are skin conditions from being cold, either damp cold for a long period of time without drying off, or the damp cold and the blood rushing back to the surface. So moisture management, again, it comes back to moisture management, good clothing choices, and managing yourself. And then sunburn can really be an issue. Don't forget maybe a little sunscreen and just being aware of your clothing. Make sure you don't get burned. Okay, winter survival. This could be a big issue. Just to touch on a few key things, because we'll make sure everyone has a safe trip. Have a plan, file a plan, let someone know where you're going, when you're supposed to be back. Real key thing, when should they sound the alarm? When should they call the authorities? What type of vehicle you're driving? Who all was going with you? Leave these details with ideally 2 responsible people, something that will trigger that chain of response in case something goes wrong. The second bullet point, I teach wilderness survival. I've taken many wilderness survival courses. It's one of my main passions, I think, because it can keep you alive, it can help you save someone else. And also just a lot of techniques, honestly, are just fun. It's another way to challenge your skills and learn and have fun. But I believe 90% of the emergency or survival scenarios you hear about can be prevented by the don't do anything stupid. Be very careful with thin ice, be very careful with axes, plan ahead, and you'll prevent a lot of the accidents or the true survival situations. Preventing hypothermia. So when you go out in the winter, you want to make sure that if an accident happens, if you break your ankle, if a storm comes in unexpectedly, something like that happens, you go through the ice, you want to be able to maintain your core body temperature. Emergency fire starters on your body, in your pack, fire lighters, ignition, tinder, something you can get a fire going quickly, dry clothing, some warm snacks, sugary snacks to get your body quickly. I have a list of essentials, and I have more on this in radio views and written up as well. So wanted to leave a little time for questions just at the end. Again, that's me, Scott, Bull Moose Patrol. I've got the blog, got a lot of materials on there. I do a lot of speaking for groups like this and write on topics. I do hands-on skills courses. Very excited to had a deal worked out with Wargo Nature Center and Lino Lakes and the Rice Creek Chain of Lakes for teaching hands-on skills. Unfortunately, it's been kind of shut down with the COVID scenario. It's on hold. So looking forward to hopefully getting that going again soon. If anyone's interested in any of these things, especially if you have a location for in the field courses, let me know. Feel free to get in touch. And I do periodically guide wilderness trips. So most active on Facebook, and best way to get a hold of me is Bull Moose Patrol. I've got my contact info there. Feel free to shoot me an email, give me a phone call. I love talking this stuff over. So, resources and additional materials. I think Maya's going to send out a follow-up with quite a bit of related materials to what we've talked about here. But here's a list of some of my favorite books. Snowwalker's Companion is the classic, sort of the definitive book on hot tent style winter camping. Paradise Below Zero by Calvin Rutstrom, one of my favorites. He's a Minnesotan, hometown boy. A great book about winter camping. 2 very good books about the basics and the science of winter camping, especially cold camp style, would be the Boy Scout pamphlet, the Ukpik Cold Weather Camping, and the Knowles National Outdoor Leadership School Winter Camping book. That's a real key one. It's excellent. The Alan and Mike's book has great cartoony type drawings, a lot of fun to read. Bushcraft by Morris Kohansky is a wonderful one, especially if you're doing the hot tent style. And then again, Winter Camping Symposium is a wonderful event, and they have a very active forum on their site with a lot of information. I should also mention there's some really good Facebook groups. There's a traditional winter camping Facebook group that has great discussions. We have an Ukpik Boy Scout winter camping group, some good discussions there, and another one I think called Winter Camping Adventures out of the Toronto area. So let's see, is that all I had for slides? Yeah, okay. Well, we have time for questions.
Yeah, so we've got a bunch of questions down here, and I will just kind of read a few of those and send those over to you to answer. Let's see. Just trying to read through a few of these. So somebody is curious to hear your go or no-go criteria for cold weather camping with someone new to the experience. At what point do you, as an experienced leader, make the decision to pack it up and halt the trip or keep pushing forward?
Excellent question. I think it depends how far you're going, where you're going. There again, in the planning, the preparation, I like to think about plan B, plan C, have bailout points. So if it's someplace that has easy access, where, hey, maybe we're essentially car camping and towing sled in, a quarter mile, and we can get out and we get to help, I'll push it further. If the person is in good physical condition, they're robust and strong, I'll probably be willing to push it further than someone who's maybe not as physically dynamic. And so I think there's quite a few different variables there. It is fun to challenge ourselves if you're experienced, but I'll say, so there's one photo there with my little boy, and he just turned 5. We do a lot. We get out together, but my personal acceptable level of risk is so much lower than when I'm out with him. We have a lot of fun. We have a lot of adventures. We do a lot of things close to home, but I've taken lots of pro level guide training. I've taken, week-long wilderness survival instructor courses from Air Force survival instructors. I see people doing trips with little kids that I just won't do, because it's not an acceptable level of risk for me. So I think about, what's the worst that could happen and how am I going to get out of it if something goes wrong? So I'll tell you just maybe 2 quick thoughts on that. Several years ago, we ran our National Cold Weather Leader School when temperatures were hitting -40, actual ambient air temperature. It was so cold, the governor had canceled all the schools in the state of Minnesota, but we were still running, a stone's throw from the Canadian border. So, but we looked at that and we knew, okay, very serious about being proactive, managing risk, looking for frostbite. On the other end, we don't winter camping so that we canceled because it was just soppy, wet, cold rain coming down. And we just knew it was just going to be bad. People were going to get wet and they're going to get cold. So even though it wasn't 40 below, it was more like 35 above. The conditions were just bad. It wasn't going to be fun. It wasn't going to be worth it.
Looking at some other questions, somebody is wondering what the most efficient way to create drinking water from melted snow, and how do you best filter out small debris, or is there another way that you access your water?
Yeah, so a couple things. You can bring water with you. So I often, if you go to a thrift shop, there's always these steel vacuum thermos bottles there. I have a whole collection of them. I give everyone, get the biggest ones you can, wrap in extra insulation on the outside with duct tape. Bring fresh water with you so you have a head start when you get to camp, because boiling water, you do still need to purify it in the winter. Filters will freeze up, chemicals don't dissolve very well. You still need to make water, and it can take a long time. So snow, there's a whole lot of snow for a very little amount of water, and it's kind of a hassle. You have to be careful not to burn out the bottom of your pot, and the water from it can actually have kind of an odd burnt taste. So melting snow is my least favorite, but it can be done. I found that the best way to do that is if you have a little bit of water to start with and add snow, and it melts a lot better over a big hot campfire if you can get a big blaze going than a little camp stove. But most often we're drilling a hole through the ice and bringing up lake ice and boiling the lake ice. You can also melt the ice too. So.
Great, yeah. It looks like we're kind of nearing the end of our time, so I'll do one last question. A few people are wondering about wildlife or animals that you need to worry about or plan for in the winter in the Boundary Waters, and how you think about that.
In the Boundary Waters, most of the bears are going to be hibernating. They're basically out of the picture, so we don't have the same type of concerns. My understanding is bears can kind of wake up and might be moving, but I think it's extremely rare. So I suppose, wolves might be the other consideration, or moose. I guess I don't worry too much about moose. If I saw one, I'd give it appropriate distance and be careful because they can be aggressive. But the sightings are pretty rare, and wolf encounters, there's certainly stories, much more so from like Eastern Europe, of wolf on human encounters, but not many from our area. So I guess I would not, it hasn't been a big concern for me, I guess, especially with a group in numbers. You have some some protection. I actually camp a lot in southeast Minnesota, and there's a lot of coyotes, and you'll hear them howling. And when I'm sleeping out, I won't lie, sometimes my axe is just laying right next to me.
Well, thanks so much for this presentation, Scott. For everybody watching, we'll send out a follow-up email tomorrow that will have the recording and some of the links and resources that Scott talked about for you to look over and start planning your trip. So look out for that email, and you can forward that to anybody else that you think should see the recording. Thanks again, Scott. This was a great presentation. Really enjoyed having you on today. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you for future webinars. We're going to keep having them about every 2 weeks. So stay tuned for those. Thanks
All right.
again.
Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.